Hey scholars, it's Dr. Kennedy. I am going to review Module 1 out of the textbook, Critical Thinking About Social Problems. So if you look at page 1 of the text, I do want to highlight figure 1, which basically looks at how our thinking and behavior, in other words, our thoughts and actions, affect other people in the world. And as we interact with people, how they interpret what we say, the tone we use, our body language, they respond back to us. So if we come off hostile, harsh, the response we're going to get back is defensive and negative. And then that's going to reinforce some of our thinking and behavior so that we respond in the same way. Whereas we are calm, caring, considerate, respectful, if we display that type of behavior, then those behaviors are returned back to us. Also, our thinking and behavior affects how we create things in the world, whether it be the structures or institutions that we live in, the organizations we belong to, how we think about them and act within them actually creates like a culture that establishes that structure and organization, and then how it operates and what the climate is of everyone involved. So if we create an organization that is about violence and all our messages promote violent acts, then the people in it are going to think and act violently in responses to different situations, even when they're not in the organization. So in their outside lives, it starts to overflow and spread into their thinking and behavior outside of there. You'll notice this, like even if you belong to a team or something, if you're on a soccer team or basketball team, or you've ever participated in some kind of teamwork in the past, even at work, or some of the places that you volunteered, the climate of the organization affects then how you think and act, not just in the organization, but what you think of it outside of that and your interactions with people outside of that. So I just wanted to kind of point out to that. That's figure 1 on page 1 of the text. It then goes into the characteristics of critical thinking. Now these are really important. And on table 1, there's a summary of each of these characteristics. There are 4. So in order for us to critically think well, these are like the 4 characteristics that we have to develop. And that's part of this class. So you'll see this theme throughout the whole semester, is that we really want you to work on reflecting and questioning. That means thinking about your thinking. We also want you to start looking at your assumptions. All of us have assumptions, not just about people, but about things in the social world. And a lot of that's based on past experiences. So we kind of predict and anticipate things, or we've heard things from people, so we think they're credible and legitimate. So we have a lot of assumptions. And so critical thinking requires us to challenge those things. Are those assumptions true and accurate? Because a lot of times we find out that they're value-laden. That means they have bias behind them. And it's just because that they've been promoted to us, or we've only heard that perspective, that we believe it to be true and factual, even though it may not be. So critical thinking asks you to reflect on everything you know and look at what assumptions you might be making that may not be accurate or true, and that's altering your correct decision making or things that could improve your life. The other thing, one of the other characteristics is asking you to do is consider context. Different situations require different types of behavior and different thinking. If you just imagine being at school versus being at home, the context, the environment changes how you think and act. And so when you critically think, we want you to consider context. So somebody may not be kind or considerate to you, but it may be the context. If you're at the DMV and you're working with an employee there, you don't know what kind of day they had. A lot of people are not nice when they go to the DMV, so they act harshly to people that are supposed to be there to help them. Well, by the end of the day, if people have been negative towards you, blaming you for their issues that they're having with their cars, their license, at the end of the day, you're exhausted and you might be a little bit bitter, and you might not interact as politely as you wish to. And so then the next customer thinks, man, that person is mean, or they didn't like me. And then so you act even worse back. And so we have to consider context, like the setting, where we're at, what might have happened before then, what could happen after. That's another important part about critical thinking. And the last thing is to explore alternatives. As a lot of times in our thinking, we especially as adults, we think we already know everything. We got it figured out. So when we hear something, we already have our perspective, our bias. And so critical thinking requires you to go, hey, is there another perspective? Is there another paradigm here? Is there another solution here? So those 4 characteristics are really important, and I want you to consider them throughout the whole semester as you're working on all your coursework. And next, we go to the cognitive tools that we use to think. And those begin, I believe, on page 3. And they go for several pages, and they break down all the way to page 9. But there's basically 3 tools, and then we discuss those 3 tools, what the definitions are, what each of them mean, and then getting a little bit in depth to give you some examples and some ideas of how they apply in the real world. So one of them is rationality, your reasoning. No matter who you are, we all use reasoning when we think. The problem is our reasoning is sometimes flawed. So it doesn't make any sense where you go, well, I'm a rational person. But all the rationality that you're using comes from a paradigm of false information, inaccurate truths, things like that. So we have to really examine, even though we all use reasoning, what type of reasoning are we using? Is it ideological? Is it coming from your beliefs? Or is it empirical? Is it coming from data? So the exercise that we have you do early in the class is related to that. What is your reasoning like? How do you figure things out? Are you using a lot of your beliefs, or are you using more data? The other cognitive tool is your experience. So experience influences how we think all the time. I came from, when I was young, I was abused by one of my parents, and it greatly affected my life from that point forward. So I have to constantly be aware of how my experience affects my relationships with other people, simply because I grew up in a home with domestic violence. So a lot of you will have different experiences, some positive. So it makes you have a really good outlook on everything. And so sometimes you may not see negative things coming. Others of us had really negative experiences, so we don't always see positive. So our experience, that's something that we have to realize we use when we think. So we need to make sure that we're examining what our experiences were and how that might be influencing our thinking and actions that could be hindering good thinking and good decision making. The last one is emotionality, looking at how emotions then affect our thinking and behavior. You all know this. When you're tired, you're grumpy. You're hungry, you're grumpy. It affects how you process information. Sometimes because we are tired or hungry and somebody's communicating with us, we try to process it quickly. Yes, whatever, you just want to get to where you can rest or eat. And so even thinking about that, we do that with a lot of other emotions. If we had a really good day, then as things go on through the day, we're always looking at them positively and not be aware of some of the incoming signals that something dangerous or something negative might be coming towards us, because we're just looking at everything all happy, we're excited, yeah. Or the opposite, we're depressed, we're negative, so we don't always look at the positive things. So your emotions really do affect how you think and process information, so that's something else we have to be aware of. Emotions are not something that you should be sad that you experience. Emotions help us figure things out. Think about when you meet somebody, sometimes you get like a weird feeling. This internal little buzzer goes off, and you go, I need to be cautious about this person. I'm getting like this weird vibe from them, right? Or right away when you meet somebody, you get like, oh my gosh, I could hug this person. I absolutely love this person. Those emotions are good. They help us regulate ourselves and give us some cues. That doesn't mean that if right away you meet somebody the first time, you have a negative feeling that you should reject that relationship. It just will make you cautious in your thinking. And sometimes caution, right, when we're meeting people, new people, is good, because we have to learn what those boundaries are in the relationships. So emotions are good. Sometimes people are afraid that they're experiencing emotions. Later in the text, it goes on to why critical thinking is important, for credibility, strategic thinking, decision making. So make sure you take a look at that. That's reviewed on pages 9, 10, and a little bit of 11. And then when we get to 11, we start looking at the core critical thinking skills and looking at how we actually process information in our mind. So how we interpret, analyze, make inferences, evaluate. So make sure you look, there's a chart, figure 3, and that's on the bottom of page 11. So make sure you look at that just so that you understand how thinking works. and how we come up with inferences that make us draw conclusions. That's covered a little bit more depthly on page 12 with the ladder of inference here. So please make sure you review that. And if you have any questions specifically about that you don't understand, send me an email. I answer your questions, or we can schedule time to meet. The other section, though, that I really want to spend a little bit of time on is the ethical reasoning section. This starts on page 13. So this is all about ethics and making sure that we are acting appropriately, thinking appropriately, that we are not being egocentric. We have a tendency, based on a lot of upbringing, when we're children, we cry, people respond to us. So we learn right away this kind of self-centered viewpoint. And unless we unlearn it as we're being socialized by parents, family, friends, a lot of us grow up thinking about ourselves first. And that's okay in a survival. Like, I understand we all need to have shelter, food, things like that. Makes sense. But what happens is people take that outside of that arena, and it's always just about them. They become very egocentric in their thinking and decision making. And so ethical reasoning means being aware of others in the social world. And sometimes we forget that people are successful not just because they work hard. They're successful because of the people that they know, the network they have. It is your network that will train you, that will teach you the capital, that will help you get a job, that will support you when you get that job, or support you when you have a family. And if you're too egocentric, it draws people away. So that section really talks about egocentrism, self-serving behavior. It's also reviewed a little bit in a section before when we start talking about the cognitive tools that we use, and talking about that it's not just egocentrism that exists, but there's also a sociocentrism, about how society is centric. So you think about Americans, right? We tend to think our point of view about how to live is correct in comparison to the rest of the world. That's sociocentric. There's also ethnocentrism, where you think your culture is better. Culture includes things like your values, your beliefs, your norms. And we see that a lot in society. There's a lot of fights over that. You know, people have opinions about abortion, and so they become very ethnocentric. They think their belief is superior and better than somebody else's. So they degrade and treat people who, you know, promote abortion differently than those who don't. So we have to be really careful about that kind of behavior. The very last section of the chapter looks at critical service learning pedagogy. And there's a figure there, I believe that's figure 5, and that's on the bottom of 15. And it really talks about how important it is that we take what we learn in the classroom and apply it outside of the classroom. So this course is really about that, developing your critical thinking skills. We're going to learn about social issues, because social issues affect all of us. And we're going to figure out the tools that we can use, like the 4 characteristics of critical thinking, understand the cognitive tools we already have, how they affect our thinking, and how we can improve our thinking so that we can be better thinkers, not just for ourselves, but for the world in general. So that concludes this little lecture on Module 1. If you have any questions, like I said, please email me, and we can always schedule an appointment if you need to go over any of the material one-on-one. Ta-ta for now.